Our next paper is by Professor Amal Jamal, who is currently the head of the Walter Liebach Institute for Study of Jewish-Arab Coexistence at Tel-Aviv University.
Well, hi again, everybody. I'm gonna speak about certain few types of violations. First of all, freezing people is violent. Freezing people. I mean, the room is so cold that I had to put my jacket on. So it's first type of violence that I won't address now. I will try to violate your attention as much as I can. It's middle of the day. Everybody's tired. We've been hearing, tough things. So it's not a good timing to speak. But still, I'll try to do it as interesting as possible. I prepared a paper, actually, but I'm not going to read it for you. It's going to be boring if I read it for you. I'm going to talk it out and try to be as coherent as possible. And I would like to share with you the fact that when organizing this conference, and apologies from the partners, of course, after finishing the preliminary program, we found out that there were no Arabs participating in the conference. That's why I'm here. I can go home now. I think it's very important. It's very reflective. It's very telling, actually. And I think what Jad said in the morning is very important. That the Israeli reality, despite the fact that we are talking about, Israeli-Palestinian reality, and the two realities are entangled together, but the fact that one voice silences another, and it's taken for granted for most people. They don't notice it, even if they have good intentions, which means they don't. Violence or violating rights does not need bad intentions. And I think this is the point I would like to make. And I can make it really short. But having said that, I would like to make it more complicated, present something more complicated, a little bit more complicated about this reality. And argue, actually, that one of the major narratives about violence in the literature, especially political philosophy, is pacification, is about pacification. That the state and its monopoly over the means of violence, as Max Weber, defined it, and later on Charles Tilly spoke about it, and Anthony Giddens spoke about it, and so on and so on. I can mention, many people reiterating or actually somehow trying to define the state in a way that engages with one of the most important challenges in human society, and that is violence. When we look back, if I go back to Plato's Republic, if I jump to Kant's Perpetual Peace, these contributions are about violence, about the engagement with violence or the challenge of violence. And therefore, the narrative of pacification, meaning that there is an evolutionary process embedded in the state, which represents actually the ordering or the overcoming of arbitrary, brutal violence in society, as of course mentioned by Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan, embodies violation of our minds. Not only because there are many historians who disagree to this evolutionary statement about pacification, that societies are more peaceful now, whether towards the outside as a result of wars, or inside as a result of pacification within the state itself. This narrative is very problematic, and it's a valid narrative in my view. And one of the examples to use in order to manifest this argument is, of course, the best would be a comparative study. But I don't want to speak about comparative study. I would like to speak about our own locality. That's my mission, to bring this locality into being. And I would like to say the following. I've been living in this country since I was born, about 61 years. I've been driving for 43 years at least. And as you know, every driver looks at the mirror when he or she drives, right? And our looking at the mirror comes actually to warn us about external cars around us in order to drive well, be safe, arrive safe, and so on and so on. This is the normal way of looking in the mirror. And I would like to share with you that for the last few years, but gradually in the, becoming more and more conscious of it in the last few months, I look at the mirror, especially when a motorcycle passes by, in order to be sure that a misidentification act will not take place. What does that mean? Yeah, what does that mean? That means that when a motorcycle passes by in the Arab community in Israel, it's a warning that you could be misidentified and be killed by somebody taking you to be a criminal. When we look at the statistics in the Arab community, in the first 5 months of 2023, 102 people were shot dead by people mostly on motorcycles. Inside society, inside the towns. And this is becoming more and more conscious in people's mind that you have to look in the mirror in order to make sure when a motorcycle passes, people are not intending to shoot somebody, misidentifying you with somebody else. And I think this is a phenomena that has to be put on the table and ask the big question, the political question. How come this could take place in one of the most sophisticatedly technological countries worldwide? How this could take place in a state in which technological surveillance is one of the most sophisticated worldwide? How? And I pose the question, and it is a legitimate question, not only because so many homicides take place in the Arab community, but also the fact that the average of deciphering these killings is very, very low. Very low compared with when we look at homicide in the Jewish society. Or compared when we look at what is called in Israel terrorist attacks. Now this state actually deciphers almost every national attack. Every Palestinian resistant act is deciphered within a very short period of time, in average. So when you compare what's going on in the Arab community and when you compare with what's going on in the Jewish community, as well as when you look at comparing these violent acts in the Arab community vis-a-vis what is considered to be national terrorism by the Israeli state, then you have to pose the question, wait a minute, how can we explain this? How can we explain the gap in the data when it comes to homicide? And just to give you a hint about the data itself, I found out recently, by the way, that Israel doesn't provide information to the World Health Organization regarding homicide in Israel. The name Israel doesn't appear in the index. I don't know why. Most countries appear there. Israel does not. But I gathered some information and found out that whereas in the Arab community inside Israel, and we're talking about 1.7 million people, we're talking about 15% for each 100K, 100,000 people, homicide. In the Palestinian community in the occupied territories, it's 1%. It's one case for 100,000 people. Okay? The gap is huge. So it can be cultural. It cannot be cultural because it's the same culture, it's the same society almost. The conditions, the living conditions are different, the legal framework is different, but it's the same culture. So how can we explain the gap between Palestinians inside Israel and Palestinians in the occupied territories when it comes to homicide, and between Palestinians, citizens of Israel, and the Jewish community, not only in numbers but also in deciphering average? How can we explain this? I think this is one of the best examples of refuting, of how we should refute the pacification narrative. That actually the state is about selective pacification. That this process of pacification, which means actually countering arbitrary, brutal violence that is characterizing, that is characteristic of the main narrative within the literature about the state, is a violent characterization because it's selective, because it doesn't take into consideration that actually the state is about the monopoly of the means of legitimate use of violence, but in some cases, especially in colonial, post-colonial, settler colonial context, it is selective. This monopoly of the means of the use of means of violence is actually selective, and it's embedded in the state itself, which means the state itself is violent. The pacification itself is violent. The pacification process is violent because it is selective, and it's applied differently to different populations. And in the context we were talking about, it's clear in the numbers. When we look at the numbers, we see it clearly. This is one point. The other point is that it seems that the state, and in this case the Israeli state, instrumentalizes violence in order to compensate for the lack of legitimacy it has in the minds of its Arab community. The gap in legitimacy means that, the state, the Israeli state, every state looks for legitimacy within its own society. And given the fact that the Israeli state is a Zionist state, antagonistic to Palestinian aspirations for, national self-determination, equal rights, freedoms, and so on and so on, there is a legitimacy deficit, which is different, of course, when we compare Palestinian society in the occupied territories versus Palestinian society inside Israel. Because Palestinians inside Israel are citizens of the state, and they have to obey the law, and they do in most cases. They behave according to the Israeli law, whether in the economic sphere, political sphere, cultural sphere, and so on and so on. But still, when it comes to the ideology of the state of Israel lacks on legitimacy in the Arab community. And therefore, the state looks to compensate for this legitimacy. It's a it's a very what I'm presenting is very I would say initial argument. But I think it's the only argument that comes to mind when you look at the facts and what's going on. Which means the Israeli state, which is a very sophisticated state, allows brutal homicide to take place in the Arab society. It's a negative sovereignty, what I call, or it's a result of sovereign neglect in Agamben's terms. Means leave Arab society to deal with its own problems. And when homicide goes up, then society itself will come to the state and beg the state to intervene. So the state becomes the technical solution to the state of fear in Arab society. That's what we see. Most Arab leaders in the Arab community are begging the state to come and intervene. So the lack of policing since 1948 until today, there's lack of policing in the Arab community. Because the Israeli state viewed Palestinians as security threat in the national sense. And since they were pacified nationally, so there's no need for other policing. If they don't pose a threat to the security of the state in the sense, in the national sense, so why invest money in policing inside? And the fact that policing is lacking, of course, turns society itself into a jungle. Given the fact that violence is a natural human phenomenon, given the fact that competition within society will bring up violence, especially in a neoliberal economy where the gaps between the upper classes and lower classes are growing tremendously in the Israeli society in general, as well as in Palestinian society in particular. When you see doctors, engineers, high-tech people making, $10,000 a month, or $15,000, or even $20,000 a month, or $30,000 a month, and your neighbors are living under poverty line, violence is a natural phenomenon. When there is no policing, then these gaps are translated into violence. The state knows that. The state knows that. And therefore we should ask why. What is the reasoning behind it? And I think it's the manufacturing of the fear of state of nature. It's a Hobbesian reality. It's the manufacturing of a Hobbesian reality in which people become afraid to go to the supermarket, to walk around. And those of you who have the opportunity to go to Arab towns, please ask people about the atmosphere. The fear, the daily fear in the Arab towns. Now, could this be naive? Could this be occasional? In my view, it is part of the negative sovereignty of the Israeli state. This is my argument. Simple. Right? It's very simple. Which means this differentiation between, a state of nature in the Arab towns and the ordering of life in the Jewish towns is intentional. This separation has been part of the Zionist movement's policy of segregation from the beginning. It's part of the Israeli policy of allocating resources, including land resources, from the beginning. And now we are in a much more sophisticated stage in which, the natural development of a neoliberal economy in the Arab towns faces the reality of lack of policing, and the state actually has to give the answers. And I think the answer is, as I call it, negative sovereignty. Positive sovereignty is actually based on legitimacy. Negative sovereignty is based on fear. And this differentiation is very apparent. And that's why I'm here now. Of course, it's written in a more sophisticated way on paper, but I think that I violated attention enough to stop here. Thank you very much.